So let's talk about failure, because that's the only way you can really describe the American Revolution from 1775 to 1776. Despite this euphoric moment in the very beginning of the war where the British were retreating into Boston, it was basically all downhill from there. You have a few small victories, but Washington basically loses all the battles. And if you're looking at battles like Brooklyn Heights, it was only because of British ambivalence that the American army managed to flee in the first place. So this is a problem, but it's about to get worse. Being a defeated army is always pretty sucky, but being a defeated army that's hungry and that is, cut off in winter without much in the way of shelter, that really stinks. And so remember that the Continental Army is a national army, an army that is really supposed to fight for the United States. And it's kind of amazing to think about it, that the army exists before there's kind of a national government to actually manage it. And boy, does it show. Congress could barely agree on the issue of independence. And to be honest, they really didn't. King George decided the issue for them when he responded to the Olive Branch petition. So, the problem is that when the national government is established under the Articles of Confederation in 1777, there's no strong executive leadership, and that's by design. Remember that the American colonies declare independence precisely because they are traumatized by their experience with strong centralized government, with the British, right? And so what kind of happens is that the government that is created is a government that's intentionally weak. It can't pass taxes unless all of the individual colonial legislatures agree to it. It basically can't do anything unless there's unanimous consent. So the government, for all intents and purposes, can't pass taxes because there's always going to be one colony that doesn't really feel so inclined to be taxed by a national government. And so the practical consequence of this is that Congress can't actually pay for the army that it has taken control of. So what also happens is that Congress can only pay for salaries and supplies by basically paying people in IOUs. And we'll talk about the horrible consequences of this a little bit later, but spoiler, hyperinflation immediately after the war. So, after fighting a long, drawn-out conflict that lasts a little under a decade, now the new country has to deal with one of the worst economic calamities in its national history. So it's great to be America during that time period. Anyway, though, for the officers and soldiers who had to basically set up winter quarters in Valley Forge in 1776 and 1777, this was a traumatic event. Just take, for example, the words of Washington's aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton. This is the introduction of Alexander Hamilton in this course, but the introduction is not going to be an auspicious one. This is actually Alexander Hamilton, to a certain extent, in his weakest moment. So Hamilton, who sees this decay and anarchy around him, as men are starving to death because Congress can't get its act together, Hamilton is despondent. We know this because he writes the following line to his friend John Laurens. "My friend, you cannot conceive in how dreadful a situation we are. I hate Congress, and I hate the army, and I hate the world, and I hate myself." This is somebody who is known for his rationalism and his adherence to, I mean, Hamilton is a brainy guy, but he was pushed to the brink of insanity over what happened at Valley Forge. And that's really important because, spoiler, after the war, Hamilton is associated with this faction in the new government that is a proponent of a strong central government, a proponent of banks. Actually, he kind of proposes the creation of a banking system like the Bank of England. And none of that really makes sense unless you realize the significance of this moment right here, Valley Forge. Because if you look at the sources, like Hamilton is like emotionally attached to centralization, banking, finance, and this is why. Because when you have a government that is too weak, this is what happens. People die. And this is one of the reasons why Hamilton is emotionally committed to this idea, and it means that for Hamilton's great ideological opponent, Thomas Jefferson, who basically witnesses the American Revolution from Philadelphia and Virginia and doesn't really see much of the fighting, this is one of the reasons why Jefferson is so suspicious of Hamilton. He doesn't understand why somebody is so emotionally committed to centralization when, according to Jefferson, the whole point of the war is to fight against a strong central government. But to people who were at Valley Forge, to people who were with Washington, suddenly the idea of having a central government that can do stuff makes sense. And it's one of the reasons why Washington and many of his closest followers, like Hamilton, it's one of the reasons why they are so committed to this idea of centralized government. But ultimately, the long-term strategy for the American Revolution isn't a military victory over the British. That's just, that's practically impossible. So, to the credit of Congress, their strategy revolves around getting the French and other European powers involved yesterday. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams very quickly leave the 13 colonies and travel to the court of King Louis XV to try to get the French involved. Now, this is really ironic because obviously, if you're looking for, kind of the archetypical example of a strong central government that has taxation without representation, that has a monarch that's probably too powerful and maybe borderline tyrannical, that example is the French. But, there's that old adage that war makes strange bedfellows. And so the French, because of their hostility with against the British during the French and Indian War, are lobbied extensively to try to get them involved. The problem for the French, though, is that while they would love to get involved and kick some British butt, the last war didn't go so well with them, for them. And so what they want is some indication that the American Revolution has, prospects for long-term success, that it's going to be around a while. It's not just a fad that's going to come and go. And that sign was the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga involved the surrender of a small British army in New York / Canada, that area, led by General John Burgoyne. It's not a battle that signals the end of the war. Again, not a decisive military victory, but apparently the French feel enough confidence after the Battle of Saratoga to actually get directly involved. So what happens is that from this point onward, the war changes. There's a treaty of alliance that's concluded between France and the United States. And by the way, we'll make repeated references to this treaty of alliance because for the French, they think that it kind of means more than it actually does. They think it's kind of like this long-term exclusive monogamous deal, whereas the Americans are kind of view this as an alliance of convenience, more or less, except for like Thomas Jefferson and to a certain extent Benjamin Franklin, who, by the way, lives it up in Paris and has multiple mistresses and seems to have the time of his life while he's, trying to get the French involved. Franklin kind of becomes like this celebrity figure. And even though Franklin, before the American Revolution, is this figure who wears powdered wigs and kind of dresses like a proper British gentleman, when he's in Paris, he knows that the Parisians are more interested in seeing, the stereotype of the American. So he comes decked out in beaver fur and beaver hat. So that being said, though, this is where the conflict really begins to change. And so, again, for the British, this is all about, a war to defend acts of Parliament, particularly over taxation. Well, now, to defend those acts, Parliament is now involved in fighting a war, not just against disobedient American colonies, but now they're fighting a global war. They will have to fight not just France, which would be bad enough, but they also have to fight Spain and the Netherlands, along with other European powers that, while they don't declare war, they kind of act in a hostile manner towards the British. Now, ominously, Spain declares war against the British, but they don't declare war with or alongside of the American colonies, because Spain understands that the American colonies are kind of hostile to its interests. That if you allow the American colonies to kind of run themselves, that might mean that eventually they're going to move west. And eventually try to squat on land owned by the Spanish. This is kind of an ominous sign of things to come, by the way, with the United States and Spain. But, from this point onward, suddenly priorities begin to change for the British. In other words, the American theater becomes kind of an afterthought. And at this point, the worry for the British is about defending the home country and some of their other possessions around the world. So from this point, the British have to win the war in a hurry. So what they decide to do is they decide to do that thing in Scooby-Doo, where the British Army splits up and looks for clues. And in other words, they're trying to find American armies to beat up and to apply pressure on the rest of the colonies to cry uncle. And if you've ever seen Scooby-Doo, you know that doesn't work, right? Shaggy and Scooby get the munchies. Daphne goes off and gets lost, and Fred awkwardly is responsible for chasing afterwards. And Velma lost her glasses. And because of that, the gang usually gets picked off and captured one by one until there's like this Deus Ex Machina ending at the very end that saved them, right? So it basically goes that way for the British. They split their army up, and the Americans are able to kind of pick off these armies one by one. So the British decide to divide their army up and conquer the South. And the idea is that if you invade the South, then there's a large population of loyalists. Obviously, beating George Washington at this point hasn't resulted in any military victories. And of course, you could probably supply British troops in the South because of the strong loyalist population there, which means that you could fight a war on a budget, right? And things go well at first. British General Charles Cornwallis is able to take the city of Charleston, but we also have to remember that taking major cities was not something that necessarily led to the end of the war. In 1777, the city of Philadelphia, the capital of the new nation, was taken by General William Howe. That did not end the war, not by a long shot. So the British are trying to figure out how to win. They keep winning battle after battle, and nothing really works. So, after taking Charleston, General Cornwallis and his British army decide to move north and eventually attack American forces in Virginia. Um, Again, things go pretty well at first, but what the British don't really bet on is the hostile Scots-Irish population in the western frontier. And so a small British army led by Major Patrick Ferguson is basically ganged up on by a group of Scots-Irish militia in the west, and they're totally wiped out. And what's kind of telling about this group of Scots-Irish militia is that there's no general, there's no overall, like, commander-in-chief in the battle. Like, these militia groups just kind of decide to meet up for a military hoedown. They fight, wipe out this British army, and then just as quickly as they arrive, they disperse into the areas of northwest South Carolina, western North Carolina, and eastern Tennessee. So also you have a very energetic British cavalry commander by the name of Banastre Tarleton. Banastre Tarleton was a cavalry commander who was kind of energetic and liked charging at things, as cavalry commanders are wont to do. And in one battle at the Waxhaws in South Carolina, Tarleton's unit manages to secure the surrender of a group of colonial militiamen. And apparently, this is where there's a discrepancy in the accounts, because according to Tarleton, his men ride forward to accept the surrender of this militia unit, and then a shot is fired. And it's a shot that's sort of construed as, let's say, being aimed at Tarleton. And the British decide to charge into this militia group because it was all a fake out. But according to the militia, obviously, it's a very different story. That Tarleton decides to charge into this group of surrendering militia and butcher them. And so you have this event called the Massacre at the Waxhaws. And so this kind of galvanizes a lot of the, let's say, the people sitting on the fence in those areas. There's this sort of battle cry of Tarleton's Quarter. In other words, by the way, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke, because of course Tarleton had no quarter. Tarleton's Quarter was basically slaughtering everything that moves. So, Cornwallis's forces are being picked apart by guerrilla forces, and what ultimately happens is that Tarleton's small group of cavalry is ambushed by this colonial frontiersman / sharpshooter called Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan is kind of like, almost like the quintessential American soldier. He's not particularly well educated. He's a kind of backwoods frontiersman, but dude can fight. He's that person who, whenever he would go into bars and pubs, people would kind of flee, out of self-preservation. So Tarleton's group of cavalry are ambushed by Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters of Kentucky Riflemen. These are soldiers that are not really trained to fire rapidly, but they're trained to aim and carefully fire. So at that point, Tarleton's force has been really depleted, and so Tarleton is having to retreat to find a port to resupply. And on the way, by the way, he fights a very decisive battle near Greensboro called the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. By the way, a lot of towns in this time period were called, have the name Courthouse. Guilford Courthouse, Appomattox Courthouse. It's not like the entire city was the courthouse. It's just kind of the naming system that you have in that time period. And apparently the colonials don't win necessarily, but apparently the battle is so Carleton is forced to turn his artillery on his own troops to force the colonials back, which is not really a great public relations move, by the way. So Cornwallis's army retreats northwards, and his forces assume a defensive position in Yorktown, Virginia. And at that point, Cornwallis waits. He waits for the Royal Navy to resupply it. And so at this point, Washington sees his opportunity because the French are starting to bring more and more troops over. And the war in the North has kind of petered out to a certain extent. So Washington sees an opportunity. He ninjas his army down the eastern seaboard and decides to surround Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. Now, this is in some respects similar to what happens in Boston, right? You have this large force of colonials that surround a smaller British army, but the British can always leave because of their naval dominance. But even though the colonials don't have a navy, the French sure do. And for one of the only times in the 18th century, the French Navy not only shows up, but they fight the British Navy in the Chesapeake, and they win. The British Navy is dispersed. Yorktown is open for the taking, and Cornwallis knows the game is up. Out of shock and humiliation, he refuses to surrender to Washington in person and instead delegates his second in command to offer his sword to Washington. Washington refuses the sword and instead offers it to the commander of the American army that surrendered at Charleston, General Lincoln. And as the British troops march out of Yorktown and throw down their arms, the British bands play the following song: "The World Turned Upside Down." Now, we know that the Siege of Yorktown is the military end of the American Revolution. But the British certainly had plenty of soldiers in reserve. The British army was captured, but there were plenty of other armies. And it also has to be said that the British were kicking butt and taking names in other fronts. They were beating the French in the West Indies. They beat the Spanish off the coast of Gibraltar, I believe. So this wasn't like a story of, let's say, British humiliation necessarily. But the problem is that Parliament realized at this point that if they were going to continue the war in the colonies, they would need more money to raise more troops in a war that was really all about the right to pay down debt in the first place. And it never made sense, but after Yorktown, it especially didn't make sense. And so what happens is at this point, serious negotiations are begun in Paris, in London, to end the war itself. And that war, the American Revolution, is eventually ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Move myself right quick. So one thing you kind of notice here is that the Treaty of Paris is, actually, this is something we'll talk about extensively a little bit later, but some of the consequences here is that the dreaded proclamation line is gone. And in fact, the British basically evacuate from almost all of continental North America except for Canada. And what's also kind of interesting, by the way, is that, at this point, we have the luxury of kind of assuming that the identity of the 13 colonies, as being the United States is set in stone, but it certainly wasn't. What brought the colonies together is that they were all ruled by Britain. And so at Paris, there's a thought that, sure, like the 13 colonies are going to gain independence, but why not Canada? Why not colonies in the West Indies? But what, of course, happens is that the British don't budge on that point. And they basically demand that the colonies basically take this peace treaty or leave it. And so the West Indies, even though the population of some of those sugar islands there were broadly more pro-American than pro-British, they remained under British rule. What also kind of happens is that, you see the origin story here of both the United States, but you also see the origin story of Canada, because for the large and considerable population of loyalists in the war, Canada kind of becomes the refuge of many of those loyalists. And so for many of the founders, including chiefly among them Thomas Jefferson, Canada is land that will one day be American in due course. So the Treaty of Paris, at least from an American perspective, is something that is not set in stone quite yet. But it does guarantee that the American colonies can exist as one country. And also what kind of happens is that the Americans kind of throw the French under the bus. We'd make a separate peace with Great Britain and leave the French to basically continue fighting their own separate war. And by the way, of course, as it happens, if there's any country that's truly destroyed by debt, it's ironically not the British, nor is it the United States. Instead, it's actually the French, who are so indebted because of the war that ultimately this causes the French and Indian War. So this is the end of the American Revolution, and we have to have a conversation on what's so darn revolutionary about the American Revolution. Because if you look at other revolutions in history, the American Revolution doesn't really fit into that box. The American Revolution isn't about changing society or human nature, the way you see in France in 1789 or Russia in 1917 or any of the other big revolutions. The revolutions that we just talked about, these are revolutions that you can practically see from orbit, where in France in 1789, churches are being closed down and they are rebranded as being religious centers to worship the cult of the supreme being. In the Soviet Union in 1917, the goal is to create a classless society. These are revolutions that aren't just political revolutions, they're social and intellectual and religious revolutions. So, we have revolutions that have Karl Marx and Lenin and Robespierre, and in the 13 colonies, here is a pretty typical revolutionary, a really rich dude like George Washington. The founders are not the most likely revolutionaries, and we kind of have to ask, is the American Revolution really all that revolutionary? And by the way, that's an excellent discussion question. So here's the thing. If you're looking for a revolution like the one that happens in 1789, by the way, just a few years away at this point, you're going to be disappointed. But something to kind of think about is that when we're looking at France or the Soviet Union or communist China, these are states that have the power to implement revolutionary changes because they have strong central governments. And if you know anything about the American Revolution, you know that we don't have that. So the power to impact or to influence revolutionary change is not something we see in the United States. But you do see some revolutionary changes, more at the state level than in the national level, because there really is no national level to a certain extent. So here are the 5 revolutionary changes. You see the spread of Enlightenment ideas, the spread of republicanism, and those are 2 sort of similar ideas. You also see the decline of slavery. You don't see the abolition of slavery, you don't see the termination of slavery, but you do see the decline of slavery. There's a project called the 1619 Project that, kind of frames the American Revolution as being a war that's fought in support of slavery. I don't usually get on my soapbox, but if you look at the historical record, that characterization of the American Revolution is kind of hard to sustain, actually, because we do see that the American Revolution does have an impact on slavery, but that impact is very different depending upon the region of the country you're looking at. So, you have very different views on the role of women, and obviously the American Revolution helps foment other revolutions in the future. So, with the Enlightenment, we mentioned this, Lockean idea of social contracts and natural rights. And we saw evidence of this in the creation of the Articles of Confederation and the language of the Declaration of Independence. But you also see this at the state level as well, that states are creating constitutions and incorporating the language of the Declaration of Independence in those constitutions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a bit. But you also see the spread of Republican ideas. And remember, the idea of republicanism is that with Republican governments, you have representative governments, and you don't have an established nobility. In Republican governments, you could have like oligarchies. You could have governments in which you have the rule of a small elite, but they're not elite by virtue of having a noble title or a landed title. And so if you're looking at state constitutions, you see some trends. And they're not trends that extend across the board, but we can see that in state constitutions, you see an embrace of greater degrees of democracy to a certain extent in Republican language. For example, one of the last best, some of the, let's say, something that we see associated with, monarchies and systems in which you have, landed aristocracy is the fact that you have property requirements in order to vote. And by the way, this is something that exists in both the United States and in Great Britain for a very long period of time. But in many states, you see the abolition of those property requirements. So this is kind of the start of a trend. You still see states with property requirements to vote up until the 1830s, but the general trend is for those property requirements to be phased out. You also see experimentations with unicameral legislatures. And remember, unicameral legislatures are associated with democracy. You see unicameral legislatures, sort of experimented with in Pennsylvania and Georgia. Those don't really go according to plan exactly, but you do see those being experimented with. You also see, in many states, the abolition of titles of nobility. You don't see a lot of, a lot of examples of nobles in the 13 colonies, but they certainly existed. And so this is kind of a symbolic step or separation with Great Britain in that respect. Also, you see state bills, plural, bills of rights, basically documents that outline personal individual rights. And I give you an example of that in the Constitution of Massachusetts that you should look at, and we'll talk about that. But some of those state bills of rights guarantee freedom of speech, of freedom of religion. In other words, a lot of the stuff that you see in the federal Constitution, especially in the Bill of Rights, is language that is almost plagiarized from language that exists in state bills of rights. For example, if you look at Article 1 of the Massachusetts Constitution, you should pause it and look at this, but you have all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. Remember that the Declaration of Independence is just a breakup letter. It's not law, right? It's just an eloquent document that sort of articulates why we fight. But now, in Massachusetts, the fact that equality is mandated by law and it's the very first thing in the Constitution, that's powerful. But what does it mean for equality to be mandated by law? That's a good question, because in Massachusetts and in many states, you still have legalized slavery. It's not prevalent, it's not common, and it's not based around cash crops, but it's there. So what does that mean? Ask Elizabeth Freeman. So in Massachusetts, whenever the state constitution was drafted, what would happen is that it would be printed and kind of made available for the public to read, but also it was not uncommon for these constitutions to be read aloud by local town criers. C-R-I-E-R-S. In other words, people who are supposed to be really loud, probably like yours truly, and read proclamations, dispatches from state and local governments. And so these town criers would read the brand new Constitution. And somebody who was listening to this new Constitution being unveiled was Elizabeth, who was a domestic servant in Massachusetts. And Elizabeth knew and paid attention to the fact that Article 1, one of the first things in the Constitution is that all men are born free and equal. Well, what does that mean for Elizabeth Freeman? Well, she does the classic American thing of suing in order to find out. And she sues under this brand new Constitution, saying that how is slavery compatible with, this whole idea of freedom and equality? And a Massachusetts court decides, well, it's kind of not. And what happens is that by this court case, slavery in Massachusetts is struck down. And so Elizabeth, now that she has been granted her emancipation, has the ability to take, a last name. And of course, the last name that she chooses is the last name Freeman. So, Massachusetts kind of starts a trend here. But if you look at the trajectory going forward, in 1789, you have the following states that have abolished slavery, either in their constitutions or in court cases. Compare that to 1821, just 30 years later. In other words, the country in 1821 isn't all that different from the country in 1861 in terms of the balance between free and slave states. You can already see this geographic division between states based upon, let's say geography, that northern states are generally going to emancipate slaves, southern states are not. And in some cases, what kind of happens is that slavery is abolished in all but name. So many states like New York pass laws that basically prevent slavery from being an inheritable condition. In other words, slaves are not emancipated, but the children of slaves are considered freeborn. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why these constitutions could be kind of radical. And what's really interesting is that for people like Jefferson and Adams, as soon as their work is done at the Second Continental Congress, as soon as the Articles of Confederation are drafted and ratified, they're not, their priority isn't to go and kind of, supervise the war effort. Their priority is to go home to their home states to help draft their state constitutions, which they view as being these exercises in experiments in liberty. And in the case of slavery, especially in northern states, that definitely pans out. So you would expect that this would cause an outcry in some of the southern states because, again, it's in 1739, you had a large-scale slave revolt in South Carolina, and theoretically, many of these southern states should feel a certain paranoia, right? But one of the reasons why it's not as controversial as you would think is that these southern states are generally finding that slavery is not what it used to be. Slavery's not, cash crops in general are not what they used to be. A lot of the soil in areas like Virginia, North Carolina are being depleted. They're not really well suited for growing tobacco. And so let's just say that southern states don't embrace the end of slavery, but there's a reason why you see many of the founders, Washington and to a certain extent Jefferson among them, express a certain degree of ambivalence over slavery, even though they were slave owners themselves. So the question is, okay, what changes? And what changes is due to a serendipitous event that happens during the American Revolution. So, as we talked about, the war is pretty bad in the southern states. And so, a lot of times, slaves would be displaced by the war, and many of them retreated to coastal areas of the Carolinas. Many slaves specifically retreated to the Gullah area of South Carolina. And in that area, they had to figure out how they were going to make ends meet. And so, what they decided to do to provide for themselves is to grow cotton and make a living for themselves that way by selling it. Now, cotton is actually great use as material for textiles, for clothing. The problem with cotton was that it's labor intensive. Basically, if you don't remove the seeds from cotton, it basically is really itchy and scratchy. So it's very labor intensive. I wonder if there's an invention that will somehow streamline the production of cotton. But this is kind of one of the tragic developments during the American Revolution, that the introduction of cotton into the Deep South is, in some respects, affected by people whose bondage would continue because of cotton being introduced as a cash crop. All right, so you also have this redefinition on the view of women. So what happens is that in a number of cases, you have women like Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, who challenge the idea of let's say sexual discrimination to a certain extent. And by the way, you should go ahead and pause it and read this. By the way, Abigail Adams basically encourages John that while he's in the Second Continental Congress to remember the role of women, that women were responsible for putting the bite into a lot of these non-importation agreements, that women have to sort of put up with a lot of the consequences of the war itself. And think about Abigail Adams in her case. Abigail was kind of the intellectual equal of John, but certainly couldn't participate as a delegate of the Continental Congress, even though intellectually she was just as eloquent as her husband. And John viewed her as kind of like his intellectual collaborator. There's this. While John is, acting in the Continental Congress, Abigail has to deal with issues like running the household, making sure that the family doesn't go bankrupt, and also, by the way, trying to take care of her many kids during a smallpox outbreak. It's not an easy thing. And what also happens in the course of almost every war in American history is that marginalized groups become very important. War is horrible across the board, but wars are also opportunities for groups that are marginalized to kind of demonstrate their value. So one of the things we kind of see is, by the way, the 19th Amendment, the amendment that gives women the right to vote in federal elections, is passed after World War I. So the relationship between war and civil rights is kind of an ironclad one. That being said, you don't see the extension of the right to vote for women, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't see advances in the role of women. Um, for one thing, it became more acceptable for women to participate in intellectual and artistic life. Women were popular as authors. You have Mercy Otis Warren, who kind of becomes one of the preeminent historians of the American Revolution, and Phillis Wheatley, who you've already read, who is considered to be one of the preeminent poets of the time period. So we see women are given sort of an expanded social and cultural role. And we can kind of see some glimpses of this in the fact that in some states, New Jersey, for example, you do see the extension of the right to vote, but only for women who have husbands who have died in the American Revolution. But what you can kind of see is this idea called the idea of Republican motherhood. And Republican motherhood is not this. It's kind of like the Enlightenment. It's a squishy idea. If you were to go back in time and ask if somebody believed in the idea of Republican motherhood, they'd probably look at you like you were crazy. But the idea of Republican motherhood is this: that women are because women are supposed to raise children. By the way, note the assumption here. Because women are supposed to raise children, women are responsible for promoting Republican values to the next generation. That if you're going to defend the gains made by the American Revolution, future generations have to buy into that. And so the best way to do that is to encourage women to spread Republican values and educate their kids. Now, in order to do that, women have to know how to read and write. And so this kind of starts this concerted effort to educate women. In 1772, the first all-girls school is founded in Salem, Massachusetts. Yes, that Salem, the Salem of witchcraft fame. Sometimes history is ironic like that. Also, in the early 19th century, you have the founding of Oberlin College, which becomes the first college to educate not only women, but also African Americans. So again, we see some changes, and partially this is because of how women become essential during the war. But also notice how things stay the same. Women are considered important not because of who they are inherently, but because they are responsible for raising up the next generation of Republican leaders, who, by the way, according to the founders, are going to be males. So this is something that kind of leads to a related idea, and it's called the cult of domesticity. This is something we associate with more of the middle of the 19th century, but the cult of domesticity kind of works like this. Men and women are equal, but in their own separate spheres. Women are supreme in the household. Men are supreme basically everywhere that's not the household, in the workforce, that kind of thing. And next time, when we get to this point, we will talk about this painting and what this says about the cult of domesticity. Speaking of the cult of domesticity, you can probably hear my son in the background, and I'm going to go ahead and cut it and be a dad. Y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.